Before I start this personal timeline, I'd like to express our concern and anxiety about Ernie DuPont, who's very unwell in hospital at the moment, and we wish him and his family strength and all good wishes. In 1936, Dr. Robert Degos in France saw patients with what he described as papulosquamous dermatitis. She had skin lesions and intestinal pain. In 1941, Kohlmeier in Austria described a case of what he thought was a type of thromboangiitis obliterans. In 1942, Dr. Degos' patient died, and at autopsy, he recognized her illness as a new clinical condition. He named it at first malignant atrophic papulosis, and later it became known as Degos disease. Just a year later, in 1943, unknown to either of those doctors, I was born in England. About 200 cases appeared in the medical literature in the following 50 years, but scattered throughout the specialities according to how the disease presented. Many were alarmingly pessimistic, as they described an apparently unstoppable fatal disease. In 1997, I had an operation on my feet. After the operation, some lesions appeared on my legs, but I dismissed them as insect bites. By autumn that year, I had dozens of lesions, and my GP was annoyed that he couldn't identify the problem, as he'd just completed a dermatology course. He told me to go home and bathe in disinfectant. In 1998, Dr. Peter Coburn, a dermatologist at Worthing Hospital, near our home in Sussex, immediately recognized the Degos lesions, and in fact became quite excited about it. I asked him if it would put an end to my modeling career. I was a teacher at the time. I was being sarcastic. He said, presciently, "You could be modeling for doctors." He biopsied a couple of lesions, confirmed the diagnosis, but also referred me on to Dr. Robin Russell-Jones, a top dermatologist at the Cromwell Hospital in London. The tests were so lengthy and so expensive that my private medical insurance ran out halfway through. So Dr. Russell-Jones asked me to transfer to the National Health Service and continue the tests at St. Thomas's Hospital, close to Westminster Bridge. One odd memory of a day at St. Thomas's as I left, after a series of painful biopsies and blood tests and an embarrassing session in the medical photography suite, I sat on a bench in the old part of the hospital, listening to a random pianist somewhere downstairs. Only later did I realize he'd been playing the theme from MASH, probably a typical attempt at black humor by a student, or so I like to think. Since that day, the National Health Service has borne all and every cost of my consultations, hospital stays, and treatments. I continued to see Dr. Russell-Jones for about 3 years, until 2001 at Ealing Hospital and St. Thomas's, the Hammersmith, and the Hammersmith Hospital is next to Wormwood Scrubs Prison. I recall waiting in the Department of Nuclear Medicine, peeping out of the window at those grim Victorian cell windows, and feeling very grateful that I was being looked after rather than being incarcerated there. Meanwhile, my GP was not helping. Initially, I was thrilled when he realized that the letters he was getting from Dr. Russell-Jones, headed with 4 hospital addresses and numerous qualifications, were from an old classmate. They'd been at rugby school together. I saw this as serendipity. He saw it as a threat. His attitude became passive-aggressive, making sure I knew how much more I was costing the practice than any other patients. He was not keen for anyone to use the internet for information and advised me not to. My lesions were rapidly increasing, some were beginning to ulcerate. One day, I drove the 17 miles from the school where I was teaching, doubled up in great abdominal pain. Alan drove me to our GP, who went into panic mode. and told Alan I was about to die. I spent 4 days in hospital where investigations suggested a perforation, but antibiotics did the trick and I returned to work. I was finding it difficult to walk as the ulcerated lesions were covering my feet and legs. I was by now having daily visits from district nurses who treat patients in their own homes. Patients are referred by local doctors. They were trying every wound care trick up their sleeves, but the ulcers were getting worse. Alan's family was hit with 2 bereavements in the summer, leaving us reeling with sadness. Our GP called Alan in for a talk. He told him to prepare for my imminent death. Alan was in no mood to hear this and explained bluntly to him how his unkindness had hurt me and that he himself was grieving. I knew nothing of this at the time. I applied for a disability allowance, and the doctor, the medical assessor, arrived like a breath of fresh air. He took a genuine, intelligent interest in Degos disease, despite never having heard of it. He came back the next day, unannounced, to talk again about the management of the condition. To my great joy, he was about to open a new general practice surgery locally. Later that summer, I asked if I could transfer to his practice. He introduced me to his staff as a Gold Star patient. He also told me he'd do his best to make sure I lived to a good old age. Well, he got that right. His name is Dr. Charles Schlossberg. He practices in Rustington, West Sussex, and he is, along with Dr. Coburn, still a wonderful support and friend. The positivity and kindness was overwhelmingly welcome, and I began to feel safe. By 2000, I'd had to give up my teaching career, which was very disappointing. I'd been in charge of a unit for children with severe specific learning difficulties, severe dyslexics, all of very high intelligence. The neurological pain in my feet and legs was so severe, I was now attending the Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in Queen's Square, London. The pain clinic was run by Dr. Paul Nandy, another gentle, kind, special doctor. Eventually, after several attempts at controlling the pain, we found that ketamine did the trick, Special K as the kids call it. And Dr. Nandy trained Charles Schlossberg to administer it in his surgery as the trips to London were exhausting me. Although immunosuppression, cyclosporin A, had slowed down the appearance of my lesions, I'd contracted MRSA, I think you call it MRSA, at one of the hospitals while being infused with human immunoglobulin, and this dogged me the whole of that summer. I didn't leave the house except for medical appointments for 5 months. My son and Alan, my husband, gave me a laptop, which I used when unable to get about much. One doctor in a hospital had told me I might be the only Degos patient in the world, which, even in my ignorance of epidemiology, seemed pretty unlikely. So I set out to see if there were more. To begin with, Degos Disease Patients Network was simply a link on a young friend's blog. Then the husband of one of the district nurses offered to design a logo and produce a template site. Eventually, I found Anthony Cartmel, who designed the website we used for years, taught me to edit using Drupal, and managed the site as his charity, for which I will always be grateful. I took advice from other rare disease charities about how to make sure that the site is secure and serious, with verification by health on the web and mutual linking with medical institutions worldwide. I went to represent Degos disease to meet members of Parliament at the Palace of Westminster to discuss provision and funding. I was assured that although many drugs and approaches were very expensive, the costs would be met. I wrote to doctors worldwide about Degos after getting encouraging replies, and often getting encouraging replies, and some patients began to contact me from Poland, Portugal, Italy, the US, Russia, and Germany. As I found medical articles about Degos, I wrote to all the authors as well. Many replied, and some passed on the website details to their patients. One was an elderly lady in rural America whose husband, a retired physician, arranged for her to undergo plasmapheresis when in extremis. She survived, and he wrote me a very moving letter to thank me for setting up support for other patients and to recommend the intervention for others. A friend and I drove from her home near Pittsburgh to Minneapolis to meet another young woman diagnosed with Degos. It was lovely to put a face to someone who'd been writing to me in panic. She's now married, healthy, and with 2 children. I'd been corresponding with the parents of another Degos patient, a young woman, Steffi, already engaged to be married, but terrified at her diagnosis. Her parents live in Bautzen, in the former East Germany. Alan and I traveled twice to meet them. We had no language in common, but our emails went via a German friend in the US who translated for us. Meanwhile, Dr. Russell Jones in London announced there were no more conventional approaches available to treat me and returned me to the care of Dr. Coburn in Worthing. It was a bit disappointing. However, only 3 days later, after that disappointment, still in 2001, I had an email from Steffi's parents in Germany. They had read an article from Springer suggesting that a patient had improved with the use of pentoxifillin, a drug used to improve blood flow. This was the first bit of encouraging news. Alan and I went to see Charles Schlossberg, our GP, who immediately picked up the phone, rang the Charité Hospital in Berlin, and made an appointment for me to see Professor Schultz-Ehrenberg, the author of the paper. We flew to Berlin, where we learned that the professor was about to retire, and were introduced instead to Professor Zubulis. The professor was already working with a group of Behçet's patients in Berlin. He invited me back in 2 months to be seen by a group of dermatologists. Afterwards, he gave us wonderful news. Professor Orphanos, the head of the department, had approved the setting up of a research facility into Degos disease. If I could find the patients, Professor Zubulis would undertake to examine them and set up a biobank. We flew home to England absolutely thrilled at the prospect of medical professionals actually prepared to follow up and study the handful of cases we'd identified so far. In 2003, I was obliged to retire from the teaching. We went on holiday to South Africa, where Alan had lived some years before we met, and the sunshine and warmth did me good. Cold weather made the pain worse. We decided it might be a good idea to spend our Northern European winters in South Africa, and Alan was asked to do a little consultancy work out there. Soon after, we bought our first house there in a very small town called Hermanus, some 90 miles from Cape Town, so reasonably remote in the world. We were invited to drinks by our neighbours. The wife turned out to be the bookkeeper to the local dermatologist, so I suggested she might tell him her neighbour has Degos. The next morning, Dr. Brink rang me at 8 o'clock, sounding very excited, and asked me to go in to see him. He told me that when he was a doctor at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, he attended a lecture by Robert Degos, who spoke about the disease named after him. Dr. Brink took a keen interest in the details and indeed included Degos disease in a thesis. He may well have been the only doctor for thousands of miles who'd even heard of it. He was keen to show all the other doctors at the Mediclinic the lesions, one of the many serendipitous happenings. In 2004, Alan and I visited a friend in San Jose and went from there on Amtrak to Salem, Oregon, to spend time with another Degos patient. He had suffered a family breakdown because of the burden of his diagnosis and the cost of it, but thankfully had skin-only involvement. He was extraordinarily kind, lending us his car for the day whilst he was at work and we waited for our return train. Meeting other patients has always been a joy. In 2005, Professor Zubulis and Dr. Theodoridis organized the first ever Degos conference in Berlin. Several patients and relatives attended, and it was an opportunity for collection of tissue and blood samples for the biobank, as well as a pulling together of all the available evidence so far. Another colleague of the professor, Professor Konstantin Stratakis, indicated his willingness to build a Degos biobank at NIH. Patients were voluntarily completing questionnaires from the website to add extra socio-medical information to the repository being built up in Berlin. We were very keen to find some common factors in those with the correct diagnosis. I was getting a lot of inquiries via the website, both from patients and from doctors. I'd been emailing dermatologists in particular all over the world in the hope of finding more patients. In 2007, an English patient and I met up in the Hotel Russell in Russell Square. I'd never met Nick before, but he swept in with great panache. He turned out to be a barrister in Lincoln's Inn and offered to show me his lesions if I showed him mine. And we sat in that august tea room and compared arms. He too had suffered a marriage breakdown exacerbated by the dire nature of his diagnosis of Degos. He invited us to watch him work on a high-profile case involving a very wealthy footballer. He lost, I'm afraid. We met Dr. Whelan in London with his then 7-year-old son, Olivia, and had lunch at Wagamama's by the Tower of London. I recall feeling very thrilled that another clever, sympathetic doctor, this time a rheumatologist, was so dedicated to finding answers to the Degos riddles. Patrick's involvement was through his professional relationship with the parents of Jack, whose tragic death at age 5 from Degos had happened in spite of intense efforts in Boston. Patrick organized the second Degos conference in 2007 in the oldest operating theatre in America at Mass General. Several more Degos patients were able to attend, and the videos from that day are available to be viewed on the website. In 2008, I was contacted by a young medical student from Russia. Her mother had died from Degos disease, and she was trying to persuade the pathologist to give her, the daughter, some tissue samples. In fact, she actually attended the post-mortem to make sure. She told me how surprised she was to see that the lesions were on the outside of the gut. She was about to come to England to take an intensive language course in Bournemouth, 80 miles from where we live on the south coast. We met her in a cafe, and another bizarre situation, she handed over her late mother's biopsies over the coffee and cakes, and I later took them to Berlin. I was now writing to any authors named on medical journal articles about Degos to make them aware of the developments in understanding of Degos disease. By May 2010, I was beginning to lose faith that my efforts could keep previous Degos correspondents in touch with each other, or indeed with me, and was persuaded by Professor Ziboulis to keep going. It had been disheartening to be working alone, particularly as several people who'd promised assistance were no longer able to provide it. As you'll no doubt know, collaborations were developing between medical professionals, and more patients were being seen in Germany and in the US. Doctors in other countries were beginning to consult our doctors for advice on patient care. Sadly, we were still hearing of tragic deaths, and this has always caused great heartache. Dr. Shapiro and his colleagues were working with Dr. Whelan, and the Stefan Scleroderma Center became the focus for American Degos research and practice. Dr. Magro was able to contribute her extraordinary expertise in microbiology to theirs, and the first patients began to improve dramatically with the use of new biologics. At last, there was some real optimism that although the etiology of Degos remains a mystery, at least there may be some effective treatment. In June 2015, I was fortunate enough to meet up with Cheryl Todd, mother of a young woman diagnosed with Degos. She and I traveled to Vancouver to represent Degos disease at a patient organization spin-off from the 23rd World Congress of Dermatology. Apart from attending talks and taking part in seminars, we gate-crashed the main exhibition halls where we handed out leaflets and cards describing Degos. And as Vancouver was heaving with 4,000 dermatologists, each identifiable by their ID cards on purple ribbons, we approached every single one we ever met in the street and distributed dozens of explanatory leaflets and cards. Cheryl has been and is a wonderful friend. In 2016, Alan and I asked Dr. Shapiro if we could visit him to thank him for his work and dedication, and were stunned and delighted when he turned what had been a lunch date into the third Degos disease convention. It was an exciting and moving opportunity to meet doctors, patients, and families affected by Degos. There we met Dr. Manfred Bohm. whose professional interest and involvement have led to today's conference. I've skated over many details, many disappointments, many letdowns, many cul-de-sacs. But one crazy thing, which no one anticipated, was the broadcast of an episode of House. It was called Instant Karma, in which the ever-brilliant Hugh Laurie diagnosed a patient with Degos disease, just like that, but afterwards modifying the diagnosis to antiphospholipid syndrome so that his wealthy patient survived. The visitor stats for the website suddenly soared, and this was simply because of this program. Throughout this story, there's been a stream, a solid source of strength and support. So I thank all of you who've helped, at the marvelous dedicated doctors, pharmacists, patients, families, and my husband Alan, without whose love and help I certainly wouldn't be here today. And I thank Teresa Slayton very much for taking over the website, and I'm really grateful to her. Thank you.